or Ted Bundy. It would be ones for specific reasons. Like, okay, here, look at how he's looking, what he's doing. This is where we think he's lying, and this is why. And this is how you would be able to confer this to what we had in evidence already. The skill sets that are valuable, and of course they're enhanced by the training, are number one, knowing how to interview to begin with, and understanding an approach, and being an excellent listener. When you're interviewing, none of it's about you. And it's about the person that you're trying to elicit information from. The behavioral analysis unit, it works as a group think tank kind of methodology, if you will. And what that means is, like I said, there were 12 of us when I was there, and everybody working on different cases, and all of us brought something different to the table. Typically, there were like 3 or 4, and on some really significant cases, we had 5, 6, 7 of us. And again, we brought in different skill sets, we brought in different experience levels. Initially, the behavioral science unit was in the basement. It was never intended to be office space. It was supposed to be J. Edgar Hoover's bomb shelter in case of bombing, but they didn't know where to put us, and so that's where we were. But it started off like that, looking just at the behaviors to be able to help with forensics, and then morphed or transitioned into an actual unit where it was the serial killer research was part of the initial part is getting all the interviews of the serial killers to look for that information, to motivation, background, those sorts of things. I think by the general agent population, their perspective was, what do those people do? And because we were located in the basement, it even exacerbated that. We would do things like go to the medical examiner's office, or the coroner, depending what they had in that area, and we'd watch autopsies. And it was very, very valuable to see how an autopsy was performed, what the medical examiner came up with. So the serial killer interviews, I learned from each and every one of them, but none of them were the same. It's like, human beings, there's going to be some differences. But one of the things that was the same for me, being on the interview side of it, was making sure that I could appeal to their ego. Everybody has an ego, but some are larger than others. But when I'm interviewing, the FBI could not offer them anything. We couldn't offer a stay of execution. We couldn't offer better food, a transfer to prison. So, why? What's their motivation in wanting this? And what we used was that appeal to the ego, something to the effect of, you were very successful in this. So in fact, law enforcement never apprehended you. You turned yourself in, or it took years. You were so efficient at that. Could we learn from this? And the other, you could ascertain from them that maybe they were remorseful, or at least were pretending to be remorseful. You could say something like, I'm sure you don't want other men to follow in your footsteps. So how can you help us, law enforcement, help other people that might have a tendency towards that? The hardest part of the job was not knowing how cases ended. It was, I don't even want to call that hard. I guess it was just frustrating, because I know most of us really did pour our heart and soul into this. You're looking at, the victims can't speak on this, and it was frustrating sometimes to see the name recognition with certain prolific serial killers, and nobody knew who the victim was. It's not just the victim, it's her family, her spouse, people in the community, whatever she did. So there's a lot of people that are negatively impacted. The movie, The Silence of the Lambs, a large part of it was filmed at Quantico. So the whole cast and crew came down to do the filming there. I was selected to work with Jodie Foster because I was the only female in the unit. And so it was like I was Clarice Starling to her. So we went over what an agent, and especially a new agent like that, what her demeanor would be like, how she would be in interviewing somebody as diabolical as the fictitious Dr. Hannibal Lecter. We sat in my office, and she had the script and would say, at this part, they say, Clarice says this or says that. She would ask me, would a real agent say that or not? And I'd either say yes or no, I think a response like this might be better, or they never say anything like that. I had no input, but she did, and she was actually able to get some of the verbiage changed, some of the script changed. I think the scene of where she's walking down the hall to the prison cell where she's going to speak to Dr. Hannibal Lecter was very realistic, and it brought back memories to me, because being the only woman walking down that aisle, you get hoots and hollers and, that kind of stuff that you don't want to react to, right? And I think Jodie Foster did an excellent job. She didn't look terrified, but she looked anxious and she looked nervous because it is awkward, it is uncomfortable. And in fact, the file folder that she used in that was my file folder. That was an actual one that I'd had a case on. Obviously, the notes were, blank. My response to the final depiction in the film, I had to get out of FBI mode. So it's entertainment. So you can't watch somebody type all day long. That's boring. I loved it. And I think they did an excellent job. I think the series Mindhunter, which is based on John Douglas's book by the same name, is very accurate for the profiling and for the unit. I think they depicted the interview process and how they responded to cases. I think that was pretty accurate. So in looking at the basement where the offices were located, that's very accurate. If you're talking about Criminal Minds and a bunch of other shows, Quantico. I haven't really watched too many others looking at bloody, battered bodies all day long. So I did not choose for a while to look at that for my entertainment. And I think there's a genuine fascination, and it seems to be more so among women than men, for the true crime case. And I think a lot of that has to do with security, and women wanting to feel secure and wanting to be able to identify something, and then also for the entertainment value of it. But I think overall, they do a good job. I wrestle with there being so much name notoriety, serial killers again, and not victims, but I understand why that is. Unlike how it is portrayed oftentimes in the media and in the entertainment world, the FBI did have finite resources, and so it was a bit frustrating with the budget constraints because not only behavioral science but in everything else. So my first office in Albuquerque, New Mexico, were very budget conscious about particular time, and my male partner and I had some interviews to do on the Indian reservation. So one of the hotels that we could afford that was within the Bureau budget was, cockroaches in it, it smelled badly, let's just put it that way. I thought, no, I just can't do that, so I ended up sleeping in my Bureau car. I think to not be heavily disturbed by these things or go crazy yourself, I know I had to have what I refer to as a clinical detachment. I can make it analogous to a doctor, like oncologists, surgeons, people that have to give bad news to somebody. If they broke down every time they did that, they wouldn't be effective in their job. So I would compartmentalize what was being said to me, so I would do the job, and then later it would affect me and impact me. One of the more memorable things about working these types of crimes is the smell. And I can remember it there's a distinct smell in a morgue versus working with a coroner where there has been a lot of blood or a lot of violence to the victims, and then actually at the crime scene itself. At the morgue, what I remember is the smell of formaldehyde. It seems like to me a very uninviting smell, and it's so horrific. And the other thing is, I would remember I still had long hair at that time, and I'd smell my hair, and the odor would linger. So it was like hair wash, shampoo, shower right away when you got that. The FBI was always an interest to me, and I was kind of an abnormal child in that I knew at age 13 what I wanted to do, and for two reasons. One, I love this country and that we're a nation of laws and liberties, and I hate bullies. I hate people who take advantage of others and others' vulnerabilities. Thought, how can I marry these two callings, and what can I do? And law enforcement seemed like the natural choice. Well, at the time, and it sounds like I'm 105, the FBI was not hiring women. So I looked at that as good experience in an effort to make me more marketable. I started off initially as a probation officer, and then I worked as a police officer working juvenile cases, and then I joined the FBI through the Los Angeles office and went to Albuquerque, New Mexico as an investigator, Tampa, Florida as an investigator, and then I landed up in the behavioral science unit. Well, there was no welcome wagon for me at the FBI, and I was not wanted there. And there was a stereotype or a bias of what women should be doing, and this was not it. This was their job, their domain, their territory, and that's where I believe I had to work harder to prove myself, that because there was no acceptance at that point in time. I'm not saying that people were sitting on the sidelines, hoping I would fail, but they were certainly not doing anything to mentor or encourage me. Once I got into the FBI, like everybody else, I was what they called a field or street agent. But that's when I knew I wanted to get to Quantico and be a profiler. I had always been interested in working on homicide cases, but serial homicide cases and the psychology and psychopathy that goes with that. Well, there weren't any women in the unit, and so to me it's like, well, why not be the first? So I then became the coordinator in the Tampa office so that I could get as much experience and exposure as possible to the type of work that they would be doing. Well, the behavior science was a little bit out of the mainstream of the FBI, and I had worked with Special Agent Bill Hagmeyer, who was in the unit, and there was no advertising of an opening. So he verbally told me, he said, hey, we're going to have an opening in the unit. So I took a day of vacation and went and interviewed for it. Started like a typical interview, and it was John Douglas, who was the unit chief at the time, and another agent. And they asked me questions like, what skill sets do you bring to the table, what experiences you've had? Then John took, I think it was about 5 by 10 photos looking at bloody, battered body and put them across the desk to me. But he didn't ask any questions. And so I'm looking at them and I said, well, what do you want to know? Are you not asking me anything? And he goes, I know. I'm observing. And he said, I wanted to see if you had a reaction, like if you have a gag reaction, a gasp, if you look away. And I said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, we've interviewed some other females, and that's been their reaction. And I said, well, I did some research, and you were in the military, I believe, the Air Force, and you were like a tennis or a golf instructor, so why would that make you more qualified than me? Now, that was not a good interview strategy, and I do not recommend it. But to his credit, he laughed. So I was hired, I believe, maybe 3 or 4 days after that interview, and was very grateful that John took a chance on me. I think there were a lot of advantages to being a woman in the FBI at that point in time. There are cases, especially when you're dealing with female victims, witnesses, and a few offenders. So depending on the nature of the case, especially if you're getting into like a sexual assault or even some of the homicide cases, women were much more likely to speak to me than they did some of my male counterparts. I eventually stepped away from profiling because actually my husband noticed it first, and then I also recognized that I'd kind of gone to the dark side. It was a little more depressing. But after looking at, again, on a daily basis, all of these crimes and very vivid, I started to go into a dark place about human nature. I began to look at all human nature as bad, as negative. So it became just something to me that was like a cloud or an anvil hanging over. So I thought while Dale was gone, I had been working several cases where a knife was involved. They were all stabbing victims, and all of them, the offender had come in and used their own knives, the victim's knives. And so I thought, aha, somebody breaks in here, they're not going to use our knives, they're going to have to bring their own knife. So I took all of our knives and put them downstairs in the dryer. And then I was off interviewing some female prisoners. My husband Dale comes home. He wanted a knife to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He calls me and said, where are our utensils? I told him, and he said, I think we need to talk when you come home. So I thought it would be healthier and better to get above ground and get some perspective back. Well, after I transferred out of the profiling unit, I had the great opportunity. I went up the ranks of the FBI. After the 9/11 attacks, the FBI did not have a cyber division. They had cyber entities, agents in each office, but not a program or a division. So my remit, if you will, was to start that. I went into leadership, and I did touch base with all of the different positions you're supposed to. So I was a supervisor in the San Diego office of white-collar crime and financial institution fraud, public corruption. I became an assistant special agent in charge in Denver over all of the criminal and terrorism. I became the special agent in charge, that's in charge of the office for Los Angeles, before being sent back to Washington, D.C. to be the assistant director of the cyber division. And then I ended my career as the special agent in charge of Phoenix. So I wrote a book. It's a memoir, and it's called Hearts of Darkness. It's basically my memoir, but it predominantly focuses not only on my time in the FBI, but in the behavioral science unit. profiling was initially created, and it was very rudimentary at the time. Howard Teeton had a psychology background, and he was interested in some of the behaviors of crime, again, not just forensics. And that kind of grew and transitioned. It was about 1972 that it started, but it was very small and very preliminary at that point in time. The founders of the profiling unit were Howard Teeton, John Douglas, and Bob Ressler. I did not know Howard, but I worked with and for both Bob Ressler and John Douglas. John Douglas was my unit chief. He hired me and then was my supervisor, my boss, my entire time there. The behavioral science unit, then to the behavioral analysis unit, was still 12 people when I left. A few years after that, it expanded and became 4 separate units. The behavioral analysis unit stayed the same, but then there was crimes against children, and there was still the training unit, and then another one that actually helped more with terrorism. Because you figure after the 9/11 attacks, that fundamentally changed all of law enforcement. The crime classification, where criminal had been the number 1 for years and years and years, went to number 8. And you had terrorism and cyber, those sorts of things that were, at the top tier. So the unit was designed to help with counterintelligence and terrorism. I think that originally the word science had that connotation almost like, evidence, right? That if it's a science, then that's an absolute. And the cautionary statement then was about that is it's not an absolute. Again, it's an investigative tool. And the danger was that you would get an investigative tunnel vision because investigators would hear, oh, this, or, somebody looks like this, or so that they would exclude looking at others because this is what the science said on something like that. The Richard Jewell case, July 1996, is an example of one of those because he fit the profile. So if you will, they were looking for, this is the bomb that went off in the park at the Olympics. And it's like, okay, he's going to be, a loner, went through all of these things. And he showed up there and he was trying to be helpful. A lot of times you'd see someone that they want to see what the chaos that they've created, right? So they will show up at the crime scene. So he fit all of these things that the profilers were saying that he would. And that was what the example where then they focused on him at the exclusion of other people, and it ended up that he was not responsible for that. Remember, my husband, he was on HRT, they were there at the time. And then he was the one that led the effort that caught Eric Rudolph, who was the bomber. I think the future is actually very encouraging for profiling, and the reason is, as I mentioned previously, there tends to be more collaboration. Now with other agencies, other technologies, and I think AI is going to be transformative for a lot of things, but sticking with the law enforcement piece of it because it's such a valuable tool. But again, the operative word